Hey, this is CJ Crafter, and I want to show off how to use trails today. Right now, we have invisible projectiles set for our AK-47, and if you see, it's quite underwhelming. So what we want to do today is look at the Trails wiki and learn how we can use this to create special effects with our trails. Okay, so off the bat, we see we need this trail option, so let's add it. We're going to want this distance between particles option, and this will quite literally just be the distance in blocks between each of the particle spawns. We'll set this to a big number to start, and we'll see why a big number is probably a bad idea. Alright, for the shape, the default value is line, and we'll look at shapes more later on in this video. Shape data is completely optional if we're using lines, but for the other options, it's not. So we're just going to leave this blank for now. In fact, we're going to comment it out to avoid any issues. Particle chooser. We're going to explore this more in a moment, but this is useful for when you have multiple particles. If you want to choose a random particle or loop through the particles, we're just going to try loop for now. And now we can define all of our different particles. Alright, so as our first one, we're going to say crit. That's one of the particle types. If we look in the particles serializer, you have this list. You can go to particles, and you can see your version is here, and you can check every single option available. So we're just going to use crit for simplicity. Alright, so I'm going to save that, go back in game, Weapon Mechanics reload, and off the bat we have this big improvement. But right now it's still pretty underwhelming, because when we shoot, you see it's not really spawning many particles. And that's because we have the option, distance between particles, set very high. So if we set this to a number like 0.4, it's now going to spawn 2.5 particles every block. So mechanics reload. And now we have a lot more particles. It's looking better. So now what if we want to add more particles? All we have to do is enter particle 2 and create a new particle. We're going to try the dust color transition. And I just noticed I spelled that wrong on the wiki. I'll have to fix that. Alright, so the dust color transition requires a starting color. So we're going to say yellow to start, and it needs a fade color. Let's have it fade to red. Alright, we can save that. So now, since we have the loop option, every tick, or every time the projectile moves, it's going to spawn a crit particle, and then in the next one, it's going to spawn the color particle, and it's going to go back and forth since we're using loop. If we used stop, it would first spawn the crit, and then the color, and then it would only spawn the color. So it goes through the list until it gets to the end and repeats the end. If you use random, it would pick a random particle from the list. So it could be either crit or color at any point. I have no idea. Alright, we're going to set it to loop. Make sure that's saved. Alright, so now when we shoot, we see a mix of the crit particles and the color particles. So now, what if we want to use a more complex shape? We're going to start with the spiral shape. On the wiki, it says we have to use radius, points, and loops. Alright, so under shape data, we'll add radius, points, and loops. Alright, we're going to set loops to 1 for now. We'll explain this later. Points, we're going to set to 64. Again, I'll explain it later. And radius at 1. Alright, so now points. This is extremely important. Higher numbers will give you greater detail, but it'll stretch out your loop across a really long distance. So you have to find the right balance. 64 is probably good enough, but let's look at this in Desmos. Okay, right now we have a circle. But unfortunately, we can't just draw out a circle like this. We can't draw out a perfect circle. We have to plot points along the circle. So let's say we have 64 points. Okay, this looks like a circle. We could actually probably go with less points. Let's try 32. If you wanted a lot of detail, you could use more points, or not so much detail, you could use less points. But after a certain point, you really don't have a circle anymore. All right, so we're gonna go with 64. And that's what we set it as. All right, so in game, we can use Weapon Mechanics Reload, and we shoot. We see we now have a spiral, and of course I'm out of ammo. Just as a test, let's see what happens when we set this value to be 16 instead. Oh, professional right here. All right, now when we shoot, you can see that the spiral completes much faster and it's less coherent. So you'll have to play with values that make you happy. Next, we have to talk about loops. We're going to set this back to 64 so we can see this easier. We're also going to increase the radius so it's easier to see in the video, but I highly recommend keeping the radius value, but less than 1. Alright, so for loops, let's set it to 2 and see what happens. Again, professional here, forgot to reload. Alright, so now when I click, you see we have 2 spirals that spawn instead of the normal 1. I'm sure you can see where this is going. If we have 4, now we have 4 spirals. Now let's say, hypothetically speaking, you're a psychopath. In this case, you definitely want to use the polar option. The polar option gives you the ability to replace the radius with a function. Alright, so we're going to use sine 2 theta. To see what that looks like, let's go back into Desmos and type in sine 2 theta. So you'll see that this will generate some flower type effect. Of course, no, now we have points. This doesn't look very good, so we're probably going to have to use something like, let's go with 235 points. Alright, so points, 235. We're going to set loops back to 1 so we can see it better, and we're going to reduce the distance between particles so we can see the flower closer to us. Alright, now we can save. Now when we shoot, nothing happens. 1 moment. As we can see in console, we actually made a mistake. We have to include the cache option. And what this does, sneak peek into some code. What this does is it saves all of the points before we shoot the gun. Most of the time you want to set this to true. If you have a function that doesn't end in the center, then you can set it to false. But 99.9% of the time, just set it to true. It'll save you a headache. Alright, so we'll save, back in game, reload, and now we really can't see it, can we? Let's set this to be a little bit bigger. 4 times sine 2 theta. Okay, we can kind of see the flower effect. Let's try to get it a little bit closer to us. So to do that, we're going to reduce the distance between particles a bit, and we're going to reduce the number of particles that we're spawning. So let's go with 150. We're also going to spawn 4 loops instead of 1. Hopefully, this will allow us to see the particles. Mechanics reload. There we go. It's a little bit messy, but we can see the flower effect. Yeah, I highly doubt you'll be using this, but if you're a psychopath, the option is there for you. Alright, that's Trails. Have fun.